Yeah, these bans were first imposed back in 2020, and then again for one of the abattoirs in very early 2022. And the reason was simple. There were COVID cases at these abattoirs recorded. Now, under China's strict restrictions in its COVID era policies, that was enough to trigger a suspension. So that in itself wasn't necessarily immediately seen as part of this broader campaign. But what was seen as part of this broader campaign of economic coercion was the fact that the bans persisted for so long. So some of those abattoirs that had that those COVID cases recorded back in mid 2020, we're then asking, Chinese authorities, how long will it take to get access back into the market? Why has this been such a protracted process? And it seems very clear now, particularly in retrospect, that these bans were part of broader signalling by the Chinese government, essentially China retaliating economically because of a series of political disputes between Australia and China. So I think it is fair to put these suspended abattoirs in that category of economic coercion in the broadest sense anyway. Certainly it was part of that broader campaign of economic punishment that China rolled out in 2020 and in 2021, when the relationship was at its absolute nadir. So the fact that these abattoirs have now been essentially told that they can return to the Chinese market, that those suspensions have been listed, even though a number of other abattoirs remain blacklisted for other reasons, is a positive sign and another piece of evidence that Australia and China are really quite close now to resolving the vast bulk of these trade disputes.
And what does it tell us, Stephen, more broadly about where the relationship between Australia and China is sitting at the moment?
I think it's pretty notable that China is continuing to unwind these trade restrictions, even in the wake of those recent flare-ups between the two countries. In particular, Australia's dismay at the conduct of Chinese vessels in the South China Sea when a Chinese warship, viewers might remember, used sonar while Australian divers from HMAS Toowoomba were in the water, causing injuries to those divers. There was quite a bit of tension in the wake of that, some harsh words expressed by both sides, Australia expressing its deep discontent, the Chinese essentially accusing Australia of creating the problem by straying too close to China in the East China Sea. But despite that, this process of trade stabilisation, if you like, marches on. So we've now seen not just barley and a series of other goods let back into China, but also now most recently this decision with the abattoirs. So it does seem to indicate that Australia and China are still intent, at least at some level, to keep stabilisation on track. Although, of course, that is still likely to be very tested by external events. And Australia remains convinced that it has to try and diversify its markets because, if nothing else, this episode of economic coercion has demonstrated just how fickle the Chinese market can be and how quickly the Chinese authorities are willing to wield market access as a weapon in broader political disputes.
Yeah, and to that point, there are trade issues that still remain between the two countries.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, first of all, it's worth remembering that there are still 7 abattoirs that remain on various blacklists. The allegations there are different. China's essentially accusing those abattoirs of mislabeling some products and contaminating others. So they haven't yet been allowed back in, although the government hopes they will be. And then really after that, you've only got 2 industries, at least that I can think of, which remain impacted by those Chinese trade bans, in particular the tariffs that have been placed on Australian wine and the informal restrictions on Australian rock lobsters. Now, when it comes to wine, and this is perhaps the most consequential Chinese tariff that was imposed over this period, they were very, very deep and crippling barriers that were essentially laid on Australian wine, slowing the trade to almost a trickle. Those tariffs are at the moment still on Australian wine. Now, the Australian government announced a few months ago that China would undertake a, quote, review process, very similar to the one that they undertook with barley. And they say they're confident that that review will, as it did in the case of barley, that it will see those wine tariffs lifted. Perhaps in the early-ish part of next year, perhaps even in coming weeks. We'll have to wait and see. But as of now, it isn't yet resolved. Then the other subject, or the other product that's still facing informal bans, rock lobsters that were essentially left to die back on the tarmac back in 2020. As of yet, they haven't received the soft signals that they need from the Chinese system to allow them to go back in. Many rock lobsters, incidentally, are making their way to China, but they're largely making it via smuggling networks over the border from Hong Kong. So the middlemen are taking a much bigger cut, and rock lobster producers in Australia, at least last I heard, are still not making nearly so much money as a result. So wine and lobsters are the two outstanding ones on top of those last remaining abattoirs. Once they're resolved, I think it's fair to say that that's the end of the matter. They are the last outstanding goods from Australia which were targeted at the depths of the relationship. And once those bans have been lifted, I think we can say that will bring China's campaign of economic coercion against Australia to an end. But like I say, it's made an indelible impression upon the minds of not just some of those industries, but also on Australian policymakers here in Canberra. So I don't think that things will ever suddenly magically return to 2016 or 2018, the heyday of the relationship, simply because China has allowed Australian products back in. The fact that China behaved like this and wielded trade as a political weapon, it's made a real impression on Australia, and some things will never be the same again as a result.
Yeah, it's a cautionary tale. Good to have you on, Stephen. Thanks.
Thanks, Beverley. Really appreciate it.